The man who cut off his own arm. Aaron Ralston was an experienced hiker and outdoorsman. He had climbed all of Colorado's highest peaks alone, usually in winter, and he had a habit of not telling anyone where he was going. So when he set off for a solo hike through Blue John Canyon in Utah in April 2003, nobody knew where he was. No note, no itinerary, nobody expecting him back at a specific time. About an hour into the hike, while he was squeezing through a narrow slot canyon, an 800-pound boulder shifted and came down on his right hand, pinning it completely against the canyon wall. He couldn't pull it free. He couldn't move the boulder even slightly. He had a small amount of water, a little food, a cheap multi-tool with a dull blade, and a video camera. He spent the next 5 days trying everything he could think of. He chipped at the boulder for hours and barely made a mark. He tried to rig a pulley system using his climbing gear. He rationed his water more and more carefully as the days went by. And by day 5, he had no water left at all and had started drinking his own urine to stay alive. He had also begun recording goodbye messages on the camera, fully expecting to die there. And then something shifted in how he was thinking about the situation. He realized the boulder wasn't going anywhere, and neither was his hand. The only variable left was his arm. He broke both bones in his forearm by torquing his body against the wall, then used the dull blade on the multi-tool to cut through everything else. The amputation took roughly an hour. Afterward, he rappelled down a 60-foot cliff drop one-handed, hiked several miles out of the canyon, and was spotted by a Dutch family on vacation who contacted rescue services. By the time help reached him, he had lost close to 25% of his body weight. His first request was for a cheeseburger. He later said that the moment he made the decision, the fear and panic completely disappeared, and he felt calm for the first time in days. The girl who fell from the sky. On Christmas Eve, 1971, Lanza Flight 508 left Lima, Peru, and flew straight into one of the worst thunderstorms in the region's history. Lightning struck the aircraft, and it broke apart at around 10,000 feet. Julianne Kopsa, 17 years old, fell from the disintegrating plane still strapped to her row of seats and dropped through the canopy of the Amazon rainforest. She was in freefall for about 2 miles. She landed in the jungle and survived. Of the 92 people on board, she was the only one. She woke up alone on the jungle floor with a broken collarbone, one eye swollen nearly shut, a deep gash in her upper arm, and a day-old candy bar. Her mother, who had been seated right next to her, was gone. Julianne had grown up partly in the Amazon because her father was a biologist who ran a research station there. She had spent years watching nature documentaries with him and listening to him talk about the jungle. One thing she remembered clearly was him saying that if you're ever lost, follow water downstream, because eventually it leads to civilization. So she found a small stream and started walking along it. She walked for 11 days. She waded through rivers and slept on the banks because she was afraid of what was in the trees and on the ground at night. She ate almost nothing because she couldn't identify what was safe. The cut on her arm became badly infected, and she found maggots living inside the wound. She discovered a can of gasoline at an empty camp along the river and used it to flush them out. On the 11th day, she found a boat with an engine, and near it a shelter. She slept there overnight, and the next morning a group of local loggers found her and took her by canoe to get medical help. When search teams went back to the crash area, they found that a small number of other passengers had also survived the fall, but had stayed near the wreckage waiting for rescue. None of them made it. Julianne survived because she moved. 76 days alone at sea. Stephen Callahan was an experienced sailor who had designed and built his own small sloop. In January 1982, he set off solo across the Atlantic Ocean from the Canary Islands headed for the Caribbean. About a week into the crossing, something struck the hull of the boat in the night. He believed it was a whale, and the boat began taking on water rapidly. It sank in under an hour. He managed to grab an emergency bag and climb onto a 5.5-foot inflatable life raft before the boat went under completely. The bag contained basic things: a few cans of food, a spear gun, a solar still he could use to convert seawater into drinking water, some flares, and basic repair equipment for the raft. What followed was 76 days of drifting across roughly 1,800 miles of open Atlantic Ocean, which remains the longest solo survival on a life raft in recorded history. The raft developed leaks almost immediately and kept developing new ones as the weeks went on, so he was constantly patching it and inflating it by hand. The solar still produced barely enough fresh water to keep him alive, and on some days, not quite enough. He caught fish using the spear gun and ate them raw. 3 separate ships passed close enough that Callahan was certain the crew could see him. He used his flares each time. He waved, all 3 kept going. A fishing boat eventually spotted him near the Caribbean island of Marie Galante. He had lost about a third of his body weight, his legs were covered in saltwater sores, and he had been alone on the open ocean for longer than almost anyone in history. What researchers and survival experts have studied closely since then is how he remained mentally functional across 76 days of deteriorating conditions and total isolation. He kept a detailed log, maintained a strict daily routine, and set himself small specific tasks each day. He later described the shift in mindset that he believed kept him alive, the moment he stopped thinking of himself as someone waiting to be rescued and started thinking of himself as the person responsible for the raft's survival. Something in how he made decisions changed completely. The survivors who did the unthinkable. On October 13, 1972, a Uruguayan Air Force flight carrying a rugby team, their friends and their families crossed into the Andes Mountains and crashed at around 11,800 feet elevation. The impact killed several people immediately. The survivors had almost no supplies, no cold weather gear, and no way to contact anyone. A few weeks after the crash, an avalanche swept through the wreckage while people were sleeping inside it and killed 12 more. The 16 people who ultimately survived were on that glacier for 72 days. The Andes in winter dropped to around minus 40 degrees at night. There was nothing to eat in any direction. 8 days after the crash, authorities called off the search, deciding that nobody could have survived the impact or the altitude. The survivors heard this announcement on a small transistor radio they had found in the wreckage. They discussed whether to tell the others and decided to wait a few days before sharing the news. The group eventually made a decision that they talked about openly and at length together. With no food and no prospect of rescue, they decided to eat the flesh of the passengers who had died. Most of them were Catholic, and the conversation around whether it was acceptable went on for days. They ultimately reasoned that their friends who had died would have wanted them to live and that it was no different in principle from receiving communion. They said later it was the hardest decision any of them ever made, and that they made it as a group so no one carried the weight of it alone. 2 of the survivors, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, eventually hiked out across the Andes in the middle of winter with almost no equipment. Mountaineers who later analyzed the route said it was a crossing that trained climbers with proper gear would consider extremely difficult. After 10 days of hiking, they found help and helicopters went back for the rest. All 16 were still alive. The survivors chose to tell the full story publicly themselves before rumors could define it for them. The man left for dead. Hugh Glass was a fur trapper working with a large expedition through the American frontier in the summer of 1823. While scouting ahead of the group near the Grand River in what is now South Dakota, he came across a grizzly bear and her cubs at extremely close range. The bear attacked before he had any real chance to respond, biting through his scalp, tearing open his back down to the bone, and mauling his neck and legs badly. Other members of the expedition heard the commotion, shot the bear, and pulled it off him. But the damage was so severe that the group's leader was certain Glass would not survive the night. He couldn't be moved, and the expedition couldn't wait indefinitely in hostile territory. 2 men were assigned to stay with him until he died, give him a burial, and then catch up with the rest of the group. They stayed for 2 days. Glass was still breathing but unconscious and not improving. They took his rifle, his knife, his fire kit, and his remaining supplies, told him they were sorry, and left. When they rejoined the expedition, they reported he had died. He had not. Glass came back to consciousness alone on the ground with no tools, no weapons, infected wounds, and a broken leg. Fort Kiowa, the nearest American settlement, was about 200 miles away. He could not stand. So he started crawling. He reset his own broken leg as best he could, packed his back wounds with mud to keep flies out, and began moving. He ate berries and roots when he could find them. He found a bison calf that wolves had taken down, and managed to drive the wolves off long enough to eat from the carcass. He understood enough about infection to let maggots work on his wounds rather than trying to clean them out. They ate the dead tissue and slowed the spread. After roughly 6 weeks of crawling and eventually walking, he reached Fort Kiowa. He later tracked down both men. The first had joined the army, and Glass reportedly decided that starting a confrontation with an enlisted soldier in peacetime wasn't worth the trouble, so he let him go. He found the second man not long after and let him go as well, without ever fully explaining why. He went back to trapping and lived on the frontier for another decade. His survival, the distance, the injuries, the timeline, the fact that he did all of it without any equipment, sits at the outer edge of what most people would consider physically possible.